Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Trang and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Refinitiv Perspectives live stream. Households in Japan have been hit with massive electricity bills as the country in recent months have been experiencing some of the worst price volatility and price hikes the country has seen since the power market has been deregulated in 2016. So I'm really excited to be joined by two colleagues of mine, Sergei Kurin and Hansen, to discuss the reasons behind this sudden price surge and the latest power and energy market trends in the country. So please welcome Sergei and Peter.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction.
Good morning to the both of you, and thanks so much for joining us today. I wanted to turn to you, Sergei, with my first question to really perhaps walk us through why this sudden price surge happened in I think, January this year and also in the last few months in Japan.
Well, I would say, first of all, it's a combination of different factors. There is no one single reason, but most importantly, when we talk about these price spikes, we have to take a look at the temperature that was in January in Japan. So as you can see on this chart, you see the temperature, how it evolves over time, and it's shown in blue. And we see that during the first weeks of January, it was lower than the normal temperature, the normal, which is calculated as an average for years. So we see that this temperature was actually much lower. And as a result, it led to the situation, it's on the next chart, when the consumption was actually higher than it was supposed to be. The consumption here is also shown in blue on this chart. We also show on this page different factors influencing these price spikes. You see this price profile in red. So on the supply side, it was also important to mention the situation with LNG. LNG stocks were not topped up ahead of winter. So there was definitely a problem with LNG supply. And also when it comes to intermittent power generation and mainly solar in Japan, you see this yellow curve, which shows the generation output from solar power plants. Due to snow, some of power plants were disabled and it led to very low power output from solar. So to sum up, all these three factors on the demand side, low temperature, on the supply side, the situation with LNG and solar power production, they contributed these price spikes that you see here on this chart.
Thanks, Sergei. And do you see the same volatility and price spikes to continue this year as well?
Again, it's highly dependent on the weather conditions, also hydro balance and intermittent power generation. We can just take a look first at the temperature forecast for next month and a half. You see here on this chart, this is the temperature forecast and the temperature is shown in red. You will also see this normal temperature. So we can basically compare these two temperatures and see that the forecasted temperature will be higher than the normal temperature. It means that the weather will be warmer than it's supposed to be. On the supply side, we do not expect any significant deviations when it comes to solar power output, also hydro balance and inflow, so they are within normal levels. So for next month and a half, we do not expect abnormal price movements. But when it comes to price volatility and possible price spikes, it usually happens when there is a situation with tight demand and supply balance. And I think to illustrate it, we can just take a look at this chart where we show the demand scenarios for next years. So it has cyclic structure with multiple peaks. And usually this tight demand and supply balance happens when we have one of those peaks. And the first peak have already passed in January. This is the situation with price spikes we observed recently. But the next peak is likely to happen in the middle of summer, between July and August. So we might expect some price volatility during this period of time due to possible hot weather and high demand for cooling.
Thank you. And you've touched on issues around supply with LNG and solar, but can you perhaps walk us through electricity supply in Japan in general for anyone who's not familiar?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say it's quite diverse, the electricity supply in Japan. And it's almost 10 years after the Fukushima disaster. And on this we see that the large share of total energy mix is presented by thermal power and mainly LNG. It's area in gray. On this chart when we show the supply mix. Also, when it comes to renewables, in renewables we include hydro, solar, and wind generation. They give in total 18%. So the yellow area is solar, and the blue area is hydro here. So, and the wind is very low. Now is less than 1%, but they have some projects in Japan to increase the share of wind. Also, when it comes to nuclear power, you see this red stripe that actually shows the nuclear power generation, and it's now roughly 5 to 6% of total energy mix.
Thank you. Sergei mentioned around renewables and renewable projects. So I guess the next question I have is to you, Petr, around the last announcement by Japan last year to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. How will it impact supply and especially renewables?
Yeah, I mean the Japanese government has high ambitions for renewables, and among other technologies, they aim to increase the offshore wind generation to 10 gigawatt by 2030, and obviously with more increased penetration or more intermittent generation, this will basically increase the price volatility further in the Japanese market.
Okay, and do you see any challenges to the development of renewable power supplies in Japan?
Yeah, I guess there is a few obstacles, as it is also in other markets. One of them is grid capacity. With intermittent power, you basically need to increase your capacity on the grid to handle it. Today, this is implemented output control, which basically means that you can, without limits and without compensation to generators, you can basically curtail the solar and wind, which basically, and I think there is a need for.
So I can actually also comment on what just Petr said. This situation with the curtailments, for instance, METI is a Ministry of Energy, Trade and Industry in Japan. They are discussing new rules for output curtailment in order to expand the use of renewable energy source electricity. Because now, what Petr said, they are not compensated in case of curtailment, and this, of course, do not create incentives and make this situation quite difficult. As for the cost of installation, the first reason, it's essential to continue different support mechanism and namely feed-in tariff program. So what I can add in terms of the grid system, there is an organization called OCCTO in Japan. It's responsible for regional interconnections. It's considering a long-term plan to strengthen the grid and implement better practices for grid operation. So it means that on the technology front, they might develop larger and more cost-efficient batteries, and it's essential to expand the interconnection using these cost-efficient batteries when more renewable energy power generation is using in the energy mix.
Thank you. And Petr, I'm glad to see you back. Do you want to add anything? Because I think you got cut off a bit.
I think Sergei came in a little late, but I think he's basically covered what I was going to say. So thanks, Sergei, for jumping in there.
No problem. And I guess renewables on the one side, but Japan is still highly dependent on thermal power generation, which I think is using a variety of different fuels, including coal and LNG. How do you see that dependence continue in the coming years, and how will it impact the market for these two commodities?
Yeah. So the government aim to basically have an energy mix in the energy mix plan. They aim to have nuclear power to be around 20 to 22% of the total power production in 2030. So, but given that, I mean, the utilities are still struggling to restarting existing reactors, And it might be a bit difficult to discuss construction of new nuclear power plants with the current general sentiment on nuclear power in Japan. So yeah.
I think I could also add that just a few days ago there was a press conference and Japan's Federation of Electric Utilities announced that they may expect a breakthrough in storage battery technology that actually may enable renewable power to meet the entire electricity demand by 2050. Very ambitious and challenging goal. But realistically, they would need a renewable with storage battery, with carbon capture storage, and nuclear power as well, as much as possible to meet a larger power demand by 2050.
Okay, really interesting, especially there's so much discussion around carbon capture and storage technologies. And I think around the world, the potential is there, but I think the technology seems to not perform as well as people expect. So this is quite interesting coming out from the Japanese government. And I think both of you touched on the Fukushima incident, which now it's impossible to imagine. It's almost been a decade that it happened. But how do you see that impact public sentiment on the long run? And do you see any new nuclear power stations, being built and coming on board, especially as you mentioned that there has to be this mix between different sources of energy?
I think what's already Peter mentioned, they have basically the plan in Japan to increase the share of nuclear power. Of course, they are quite reluctant to do so due to public sentiment, but it's impossible to avoid these kind of situations with more renewables in place when the price volatility may go further. And of course, it's always a need for constant and baseload power generation. So they will definitely focus on increasing the share of nuclear power for next years.
Okay. And how is the demand and supply really balanced out for electricity in Japan, especially when you have such a sudden high demand, like you mentioned, when weather conditions change, Sergei?
Well, they have in Japan adopted a balancing mechanism, grid balancing mechanism, which is actually based on demand and supply plans submitted by retailers and power generators. So it means that each retailer must submit its demand, procurement, and sales plan. And the same thing is applied to generators. They also must submit its power generation, procurement, and sales plans to the organization OCCTO. We already mentioned it. It's responsible for interregional interconnections and transmission. Then this organization, it checks the balance of electricity demand and supply based on the submitted plans. And it may require necessary amendments from retailers and power generators to make demand and supply balanced. So it means that if the actual amount of demand and generation are inconsistent, not according to the plans, so the retailer or power generator, they should pay an imbalance charge.
Okay, interesting. And Peter, can you explain us how electricity is traded between suppliers and generators in the country?
Yes. So let's go to EIKON. Just I think it's a good illustration. So in Japan, you have different the operators of the different areas. You have also different hertz in the area. So on the top chart here, you have the 50 hertz areas, and the chart below you have the 60 hertz areas. And the day-ahead spot price is traded on the JPEX power exchange. And basically, what you can see here, if you're scrolling down, you see here basically all the areas, and then you have the system price on the right. And the system price is not it's not the average of the area prices; it's an unconstrained price. So basically, for those of you that are familiar with trading in the Nordic countries, it's a similar system price basically. The 24-hour period is divided into 48 units. So basically, you have a half-hour resolution on your day-ahead contracts, and it's basically a normal blind single price auction where each is bidding for a combination of price and quantity for each product. In addition, you basically also have OTC trading and bilateral trading, but roughly around 40% of the total power sales in Japan is going over the JPEX exchange, and this has rapidly increased over the past couple of years.
Thank you. And can you tell us more about how much electricity is being traded on the Japan Power Exchange?
Yeah, so basically you have 40% on the JPEX Power Exchange.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on liquidity on the derivatives side?
Yeah. So today you can trade the future power contracts on the Tokyo Commodity Exchange. You can trade it on the NYMEX. You can trade on JPEX. And you also have EX that joined this Japanese market in May 2020. So the liquidity has been rather low in Japan, but we see high interest from international players and investors because this is a market which is very similar to Europe. So many of our European clients is now joining this market as well, as they already are familiar with EX. And EX actually set a record now in January with registered volume of over 1 terawatt hours. So we think this is a really interesting market to follow, and with also the price volatility we saw in this January, you really see the need for secure your power also in Japan, and we think this is a really interesting market for us to basically follow going forward, and that's why we have done investments and presently have more and more content on this market. So it's really exciting, actually, what's happening, even though it's for consumers, high prices is not optimal, but with the liquid derivative markets, it could help out.
Yeah, I guess maybe households in Japan don't necessarily agree with you, but I think definitely are lots of really interesting trends. And I guess to wrap up, there was like a question from our listeners, and I know LNG is not your main area of focus, but I think that's something worth covering, because especially with like LNG supply issues recently, do you see this reliance continue? I know you mentioned power mix and renewables and everything, and if yes, what are the top 3 suppliers of LNG for Japan?
Yeah, as I already mentioned, in the thermal power mix, and the thermal power represent roughly 75% of total generation, and they rely heavily on LNG, and it's continue being one of the major source of energy for Japan. So there is no doubt. When we discuss the top suppliers, they mainly they produce basically LNG. Middle East, Qatar, they even supply it from the United States. So basically all countries that have this LNG production, and it's on the long-term contracts usually. And when it happened, the situation with price spiked, they also bought a lot of LNG by long-term contracts, but it was not enough to cover the demand, and they had to buy it on the spot market as well. So it might happen, and we do not expect that there are any changes in this tendency to use LNG for next years for Japan.
Thank you. And I guess that explains really the issue with the prices, right? When the supply is limited, and I guess the reason why countries need to really diversify their energy sources. So with that, I wanted to thank Sergei and Peter for joining us today. It was a very insightful session, really talking about energy trends in Japan, but I think about issues around energy supply that I think impacts markets around the world. So I hope everyone enjoyed today's session. And if you wanted to find out more, we'll have a QR code on screen soon, which allows you to access, to find out more, I think, about our commodities data and charts that you've seen our 2 speakers use today in EIKON. And as always, do subscribe to our social media channels, and I look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you and take care.